Welcome back, my friends, to AA Recovery Interviews. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where Alcoholics Anonymous members from around the world share their extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. There are more than 150 awesome interviews in the AA Recovery Interviews podcast series. Listen to every episode on any podcast app or at the website aarecoveryinterviews.com. Each story is a powerful testimony of the recovery available to all in AA. Today is an encore episode of my interview with Jim W., originally released in June 2021. Jim has been sober in AA since June of 1989. My guest on today's show is my close friend, Jim W., who's been a member of AA 32 years. His journey through alcoholism and drug addiction started early in life. After Jim's parents divorced when he was only 6 months old, he was essentially raised by his two sisters and brother, who were 14, 16, and 18 years older, while his mother worked to support the family. As a toddler, he accompanied his siblings to parties where he got his first taste of marijuana and alcohol. For his 10th birthday, his adult brother gave him a joint and drinks of peppermint schnapps. By 13, he was a daily pot smoker and drank whenever he could. By high school, he was crashing cars and getting into trouble. He also became a drug dealer to support his own habit of mainlining cocaine. Jim went to a party college, where his first DWI landed him in jail, replete with DTs and drug withdrawal. As he spiraled downward, a desperate visit to a psychiatrist and the coincidental death of two childhood friends who were on his same path provided Jim's wake-up call at the age of 21. After 2 weeks in a treatment center and another slip, Jim ran into a friend who was sober in AA for 5 years. He offered Jim help. Completely defeated, Jim came into AA in Cleveland, Ohio, and found a sponsor the very first day. His immersive experience in the program that followed formed a solid foundation for years of sobriety and service to come. Jim frequently quotes the Big Book from memory, not to show off, but in the earnest desire to help others. He still goes to lots of meetings and sponsors new men all the time. He consistently demonstrates the same firm, no-nonsense approach to working the 12 steps that was ingrained in him by the Northeast Ohio brand of AA. Jim's story is a fine example of where grateful sobriety can lead after 32 years in AA. I'm glad I've known Jim for the majority of that time and hope you'll enjoy what he has to say in this, the 31st interview of the AA Recovery Interviews podcast.
I'm an alcoholic. My name's Jim. Through the grace of God of 12 Steps of the Fellowship, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink for the last 11,679 days. For this, I'm truly grateful.
Hi, Jim. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for that introduction of the amount of sobriety you have. You're the first guest I've had who has actually embellished the "Hi, how are you" type for those days. And I wanted to ask you, is that something you've done throughout your sobriety, or when did you start doing that?
Well, actually, my first sponsor counted his recovery in days, and it's something that was passed on to me. Back then, he used a checkbook calendar to count his days, and I graduated over the years from a floppy disk to an app, and I counted in days, and it's how we get it.
Yeah.
And so that's how I count it.
Wow, that's kind of cool. Because I've heard you do that for years and years now, and I don't know anybody. Some people will say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, and through the grace of God, I'm sober today," or "By the grace of God, I haven't felt it necessary to take a drink today," or et cetera, et cetera. But I think what you say when you talk about the days really emphasizes the one day at a time nature of this program.
Well, one of the other things my sponsor emphasized with me was hold your recovery, your sobriety up like a jewel and polish it every day.
That's a great way to think about it. So what does that work out to in terms of years, the number of days?
On June 21st, I'll have 32 years.
32 years. Wow, that is amazing. That is amazing.
It's a little while.
Yeah, did you ever think you'd be alive to see 32 years?
I didn't think
sober?
I'd make it past 21, Howard. It was,
21 years sober or 21 years old? Old, yeah.
No, I was not headed in the right direction.
How old were you when you got sober?
I was 21.
21. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Needed it when I was 13, but didn't get it till I was 21.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, by the time I was 13, I was using on a daily basis.
Is that right? Wow. What was going on in your family of origin that created an environment for using at 13 on a daily basis?
Well, I used to say I was born to party when I was using. My parents were divorced when I was 6 months old, and that was 1968. The days of sex and drugs and rock and roll. And I was raised by 3 adolescent siblings while my mother went back to school to be able to earn an income to support 4 children. So by the time I was old enough to walk, I was passing the joint across the room, and I'd had my bottle filled with wine. And but please don't misunderstand. I don't blame my parents. I don't blame my siblings for my alcoholism. You know, there came a point in time where I made a real clear decision that was how I was going to gain that sense of ease and comfort, was by taking a few drinks.
That's interesting. One of my other guests who I interviewed early on in the series, she was the oldest child, and because of her mother's not being there and her father not being there for whatever reasons, as the oldest sibling, she was given the responsibility of essentially raising the younger siblings. Is that what happened in your home?
You know, my mother was there. I mean, but she had gotten married when she was 17. She had had her first baby at 18.
Yeah.
Was divorced at 36 and didn't have any kind of career track or path. And, you know, back then it was much more of a traditional kind of misogynistic household of daddy earned the living and mommy stayed home and raised the children. And so that's what she did. It was a generational thing. And then at 36, when she's divorced, all of a sudden she's got to go to college. I was really proud of her. I mean, she not only endured the agony of a really ugly divorce, but she got her master's degree in 3 years.
Wow.
After delivering a baby, you know, 6 months later, you know.
So she was 36 when you were born?
Yes.
Okay, so the divorce happens right after that?
Within 6 months.
Wow. Yes. Wow.
One time for old time's sake is what they say.
But do you know what went on during that time in your family that created a situation for divorce shortly after you were born?
You know, I've gotten some of the story. I don't know that I've ever gotten all of the story. I've gotten, you know, I don't know if there was infidelity. My mother claimed that she was assaulted.
Oh, okay.
And my father thought that it was much more of a consensual, was in his mind.
In his mind.
Yeah, and I don't know what came first, to be honest with you. I don't know if her infidelity or assault happened before he hooked up with the neighbor next door, but he ended up marrying the woman next door.
Wow.
And then adopting 2 children who were my stepbrother and sister, who I resented for probably 2 decades of my young childhood and adolescence.
So on your mother's side, from the marriage till the point at which she got divorced, how many siblings are there?
My oldest brother, who was the firstborn, he was 18 when I was born.
Wow.
My oldest sister was 16 when I was born, and my youngest sister was 14 when I was born. And so it was really kind of interesting because I had all these wonderful adolescents who really didn't know what they were doing when it comes to raising a child.
Yeah.
And I was surrounded by a bunch of hippies. It was a very loving environment. So I had this childhood of, you know, having these siblings who were much older than I was for a time.
Right.
But within, you know, the first 5 years of my life, they were all grown and gone. And so I became an only child almost.
By the time they were gone, then who was your mother back to taking care of you?
Well, she had to work, but, you know, I was a latchkey kid.
So would you say that all of that contributed to what happened when you turned 13 and started using? Or?
Oh, I didn't start using at 13. I was using on a daily basis at 13.
At 13.
Yeah. For my 10th birthday, my brother-in-law gave me a joint.
Oh, no.
You know, he also took me to the bar that he owned and got me drunk.
Oh my
Peppermint
God.
schnapps. And so,
wow.
You know, I had started using long before then. Socially,
quote
socially. Unquote, if, you know, school-age children use socially, which I don't think is really true, but from a perspective of the transition between using with my family versus using with my friends, it happened in about 6th or 7th grade. You know, by that time it was, by the time I was 13, it was daily.
So when you were a kid, the using that you did, some of it was on your own accord, some of it was you were brought into it by siblings or situations. It occurs to me that you might not have drank peppermint schnapps unless you had been taken to the bar.
Correct.
Right. So a lot of the things that occurred to you when you were a young kid were not of your own volition, but just because you were part of the scene that was doing all that kind of stuff, huh?
Yeah, I think there was definitely a strong environmental influence, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I also remember being very involved in athletics prior to my adolescence and making a conscious decision to give up on sports so that I could do more partying.
So the guys who you were hanging out with on the sports end of things, or when you were involved, they weren't doing the things that you were doing with regard to drinking or using?
No, I had these friends who were academically focused and or athletically focused, and then there were the other friends that were partying, and there was definitely a distinction in regards to, I don't know if they still call them nerds nowadays, but nerds and jocks and burnouts, and that was kind of the terminology. And
so were you a burnout?
Yes, absolutely. Flannel shirts and concert T-shirts underneath, and ratty jeans, and joined a gang at the age of 13 as well.
Now, where did you end up in the pecking order of the gang or groups of friends, of groups of burnouts around you? Were you a leader? Were you a follower? Were you an instigator? Were you one of these who hung in the background?
I would never classify myself as one who hung in the background. I always hung out with kids that were older than I was.
Oh, yeah.
And, I think that's probably fairly understandable in growing up with such older siblings.
Yeah.
And so from that perspective and hanging out with anyone who was older than I was, I don't know that I took on a leadership role there, but definitely with my own peers, I was an instigator. I mean, I was troubled. I was an angry young man and was willing to do anything to express it except for, in a healthy, appropriate manner.
So you got whatever affirmation that you needed as a kid from hanging with these different groups?
Oh, well, it was a transition from my family and what I knew as interactions at a familial level to, to a social level with my friends and peers.
So this is all going on in and around middle school, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, we called it junior high.
Junior high, yeah,
but,
that's right.
No, I mean, I was using in elementary school.
Wow.
The first time I ever ran away was in elementary school.
Yeah.
And I remember using it. It wasn't daily at that point in time, but again, by 7th grade, it was daily.
Did you ever get caught?
I reference using because, at 13, the access to alcohol is much more difficult than it is to anything else, specifically marijuana at that point in time. Getting caught, I mean, there was more than one occasion where we were stopped by the police, but never really caught on a possession charge. I mean, I remember specifically one instance where we had found a pipe. It literally was at this party, and we found it. And one of my friends had a bag of weed on him. And so the cop pulls us over, stops us for curfew, searches us, finds the pipe, and we're all consistently telling him we found it at this party. And while we're all consistently telling him that, my friend's shoving the bag of weed down his pants, so he never found it.
Oh, wow.
To be honest with you, possession and being under the influence didn't play a role until later.
I get it.
But I did have, I was charged with assault at 13.
Oh, my gosh. Did you hit somebody? Or?
I did. I think he used the term bastard, which didn't bode well for him and or me.
Yeah, I guess not. So what were the consequences of that?
They pressed charges, and I had to go to court. I don't know that I had probation or anything.
Right.
I think, I had to avoid being in trouble.
Right.
For 6 months or whatever it was, and I managed to do that. I do remember being arrested for theft. A friend of mine was, we were walking across a parking lot, and they had parking meters back then. And he had noticed that this parking meter it wasn't really fixed in the concrete. It was just kind of detached and wobbly, and he picked it up and we went running and
Did you at least get to see how much money was in it, or no?
I don't think so. We didn't make it that far. We were probably 3 blocks from his house when they caught us. But
they're a lot heavier than you'd think, too, aren't they?
They are, yes, especially when you're 13 or 14 years old.
Wow.
So I was a menace to society at that age. I don't know that there was ever a possession charge until my first DWI.
Now, you're originally from Cleveland.
Yes.
And, of course, the driving age in Ohio is 16.
Correct. And back then, the legal drinking age was 18.
Was 18.
And after I had turned 18, they changed it to 21, so I was grandfathered in, which made me all that much more popular with some of my younger peers.
And didn't Ohio have state stores?
They did.
Which were the only place you could get hard liquor.
Mm-hmm.
So you're running with this crowd, you're getting caught. Did you ever have to go to juvenile detention or any of that kind of stuff?
I never served any time there. The only time I ever served was a 3-day stint for my first DWI.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't go well.
It didn't, huh?
But it was actually the platform that I needed to establish recovery.
Really?
Absolutely.
Huh. Well, let's talk about that in a minute when we kind of catch up on what high school was like for you.
Academics lost a priority. It was no longer the priority. I was, I was getting by.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never forget. I guess it was my senior year in high school. I was actually attending a vocational. It was architectural design vocational program as well as doing college prep at my home high school. There was a transition in teachers from my junior year to my senior year, and this teacher took it upon himself. He had to play alpha male in the classroom. And he saw, I think the interpretation I had was that he saw me as the one challenge that he needed to overcome to establish himself as that.
Really?
It was very interesting. Because we as humans, we have all of these different developmental issues, and I think I think this was an issue for him. But we were involved in a car accident together. He was a racer. He would race cars and drive. He was a gearhead.
Oh, yeah.
We were on the same street. He was in a right turn lane, and I knew he was in a right turn lane. And my rear view mirror had been knocked off of my windshield, so I didn't have a rear view mirror. There was a girl with me. She was witness to all this. And so I went past the lights where he was supposed to turn right, and I didn't look back because I assumed that he had turned right. So I move over into his lane, and he's there. He didn't turn right. We didn't collide at that point in time, but what he did was he got in the left lane, went around me, and then locked him up, slammed on his brakes in front of me. And we were involved in this car accident, right? And he jumps out of his car and comes screaming up to my car and rips the door open and starts physically challenging me.
Oh my God.
I'll never forget, I think it was a milk truck. They still had milk trucks back then. It was a milk truck who witnessed everything and stopped and told the police what he had seen, which was that he cut me off and then threw the door open. He took off. It was a hit and run kind of situation.
Sure, yeah.
So he takes off, and the girl I have in the car with me is a witness. This truck driver's a witness. Anyway, I end up transitioning out of that vocational program, and the high school was more than willing to pay for me to go to another high school's vocational program to get out of any kind of legal ramifications.
Okay, so you wouldn't have to be around that guy anymore.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. So I was going back and forth, and I would drink in between one high school on the way to the other. And I'll never forget the principal calling me into his office one day, and I had beer on my breath, and he says, you smell like alcohol. Have you been drinking? And I said, no, last night I spilled one in my car, and I sat in it on the way, and I hadn't cleaned it all up. That was just the kind of thing that would happen pretty consistently. I'm the guy that was selling drugs to your children.
Oh, you were? Okay, so you were dealing drugs when you were in high school. Now, we're talking about grass, we're talking about pills?
Quaaludes.
Quaaludes were big back then.
Yes.
Cocaine, was that very much cocaine at the time?
I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, my attitude is bottles are but symbols.
Right.
And so it's just a matter of... It's all the same to me. I'm an alcoholic.
Right.
That's what I call myself. But by the time I was 16, I was mainlining cocaine.
And what does that entail?
Just intravenous use.
So you're cooking the cocaine down to a liquid, and then you're shooting up.
Correct.
What does that do to you?
I'm not sure if I had a heart attack, but I think I did.
Really?
At some point in time. And I'll never forget one of my friends he'd gone into treatment. He had a heart attack at 17, something like that, 16, 17.
Wow.
And he was in the hospital, and we went in, and they had to strap his arms down, and he was... all he could tell us was, get the bugs off me, get the bugs off me. It was pretty powerful stuff to see visually, but until I experienced it, and that goes back to that first DWI and spending those 3 days off the streets, and I went into withdrawal in jail, and it really helped me come to terms with and understand, you might have a problem here.
Did you do well enough in your selling of the drugs to convince yourself otherwise?
Oh, I thought I was Scarface.
Yeah.
I'd moved out of the house at 16. I had an apartment with a roommate. I had a union job at a grocery store, and I was selling on top of it. And so I would put paychecks in my desk drawer and forget about them.
Because you were doing a cash business on the side.
But eventually that all failed.
Yeah.
Tucked my tail between my legs and ended up moving home at 18 for my senior year. I inevitably used up all my profits.
You did? Okay.
Absolutely. I think I totaled 3 cars before I was 18.
How many DUIs did you have by that point?
Well, the first one happened in college.
Right.
And I always say I have 1.5.
Okay.
And the reason I say I have 1.5 is I was convicted for 1. I deserved 2. Well, I deserved a lot more than that, but I was arrested for 2, but I got off on the second one because of good legal advice that I received while I was incarcerated for the first one.
I get it. So you somehow make it out of high school to go to college.
I think I did enough academically to get by.
Yeah?
And I think they wanted me gone as much as I wanted to be gone. And so I'm sure that there were definitely some strings that were pulled to get me my graduation certificate, sure.
You academically achieved by virtue of them wanting you the hell out of there, huh?
Oh, I was an underachiever, absolutely. All those little fill-in-the-bubble tests I excelled at, scored in the 98th percentile on most of them. Initially, elementary school, and even some in junior high, it translated into good grades, but after a while that was no longer the priority.
Did you graduate high school at 18? So did you go off the next fall?
Straight into college, yes.
You did.
And I had to take remedial math. Yeah, I went to Kent State University. Graduated from Kent State University, I'm proud to say. If I hadn't gotten sober in college, there's no way I would have graduated, that's for sure.
Wow. My sister is an alum of Kent State, and quite a few years earlier than that, but it was a good state school, as state schools in Ohio go.
It wasn't the reason I went there.
No, I'm sure not.
No, the reputation of that school is much more about partying and having a good time, and that's why I went there.
So you went there at 18, and you told us earlier that you got sober at 21.
Correct.
So you had a 3-year run. So you actually got sober before you graduated?
Yes.
So walk us up to that point, from graduating high school up to the point at which you get sober.
I had gotten my first DWI. I want to say I was 20 at the time. Actually, I was probably 19.
Yeah.
I did 3 days because it was a requirement in Ohio when you were convicted. I think I blew like a 1.25, and back then the legal limit was 1. And so I had to serve those 3 days, and I'd never gone without drugs and alcohol for more than maybe 24 hours.
Right.
And after about 24 hours of sitting in jail, I started sweating and I started shaking, and I literally started experiencing withdrawal and DTs. And I didn't know what was going on, and everybody kept telling me, "You're going to be okay, you're going to be okay." And I ended up curled up in a fetal position in the corner because my body was doing things that I had no control over, and it was really it was eye-opening later.
Yeah. So you were physically addicted at that point.
Oh, absolutely.
And had been for a while, I guess.
Absolutely. The other thing that's important about that experience was they give you classes. They call it DWI school, but there's bars on the windows and doors, and the food's horrible. So, it was jail. They give you all this education and information, and one of the first things they tell you is 8 out of 10 of you will be back. And I sat there and I shook my head, no, that's not me. It's not going to happen to me. And then I think 45 minutes later, I was meeting with an attorney. They gave you free legal advice. And even though I said, no, that's not me, the first thing I asked that attorney was, what do I do next time I get pulled over and I'm drunk? And it's just, it was those kinds of hypocrisies that just kept coming through in my life that drove me to finally get recovery.
Yeah.
After that first DWI, 3 months later in the same city, by the same cop, I got pulled over for the same reason.
Oh, my goodness.
And I poured myself out of the car, and I waved at him, and I said, "You remember me?" And he just shook his head. But the attorney that I'd spoken to when I was incarcerated, what he told me was, don't blow. And so when they took me down to the jail, I think it was a Friday night, and they say, "Oh, well, you need to blow into this." And I said, "No, I don't." And they said, "Well, you're going to lose your license." And I said, "That's okay." And they said, well, we're going to keep you in jail here, and it's a holiday, so you're going to be stuck here till Tuesday, not just till Monday. And I said, give me my blanket. And they let me go on personal recognizance, and then they had no proof because they didn't have a dash cam back then.
Sure.
And so I ended up pleading guilty to left of center and paying maximum fine of left of center and got off. So I had 1.5 DWIs. Not that I didn't deserve a bunch others.
Sure. So had you blown into that breathalyzer?
So I'd had, I think the next level was 10 days. After, I think it went 3, 10, 30, 60 back then.
Wow.
I think it's much harsher now.
That didn't scare you straight, though, did it?
No. Well, the first place I went after doing the 3 days was to the bar. So that following summer, after getting that second arrest without serving any time or getting convicted, that summer I lost 2 friends in 2 weeks as a direct result of drinking and drugs. And the first thing I did was turn to the same thing that killed them. And I had no coping skills. This grief was overwhelming to me. The first kid that died was the first kid that ever spent the night at my house. He was the first kid that we got in a fight in 5th grade over the prettiest girl in school. We weren't real good friends after high school or after elementary school, but he was a dear friend, prior to, and it was pretty overwhelming.
I'll bet.
And then, 2 weeks later, I lost a friend. He was in a car accident. He was driving home from Riverfest, which is a party in Cleveland on the Flats. It's notorious for drinking, and he jumped the median driving home and killed himself and a family of 3 from Chicago. I melted down. And I had been to see psychologists and counselors throughout the years. I mean, my mother was a social worker, so she knew, and she would always tell me, "Oh, tell me how you're feeling," and I would just roll my eyes at her because it was too threatening.
Yeah, I get that.
It was way too threatening.
Yeah,
I couldn't accept and acknowledge and own my feelings.
Did any of those people who you saw over the years, the therapists, did any of them confront you with the alcohol or drug use, and what was your response?
The last psychiatrist, and he was a psychiatrist that I had seen, had asked me, he said, "Well, do you think you have a drug or a drinking problem?" And I said, "No, I get as much as I need." And he looked at me, and it was really impressive to me how well he handled me.
Yeah.
Because he said, "Well, that's great. If you feel like you ever need help, call me." And after losing 2 friends in 2 weeks, I needed help. He arranged for me to be admitted for treatment. Back then it was $20,000 or $15,000. And they serve you pork chops that are 3 inches thick. And it was nice because they gave me Librium and lithium and helped me go through my withdrawal.
How long were you there?
I did 2 weeks of a 30-day program.
What happened to 2 weeks? Did you get booted out or?
No. I signed myself out early. I was over 18. I was 20 at the time. And this is what happened is they wouldn't give me a white coat and a clipboard and let me play junior counselor.
So even back then you were a service kind of guy.
Well, at that point in time, it may have been just to avoid facing my own reality.
Yeah, I get it. So dealing with other people so you wouldn't have to deal with yourself.
Sure.
I get that.
Absolutely.
So 2 weeks now, within that time, were you exposed to 12 steps or AA or anything like that?
Well, Nurse Ratchet used to try to make us go to the AA meetings, but again, we were adults, so she really couldn't do much.
You didn't go at all?
I went to 1 or 2.
What'd you think?
I had been to AA meetings prior to.
Right.
I had several friends who were assigned to go to AA meetings when we were 15, 16 years old, and we'd smoke dope, go to the meetings and watch all these old people drink coffee and smoke cigarettes and laugh at them. And so I knew, and I had friends who had gotten sober in high school.
Sure.
And the ones that stayed sober out of treatment were the ones that went to AA.
Right.
And so I was already hostile towards Alcoholics Anonymous because they took away all my using friends, and so I didn't want much to do with AA. But I did have some exposure and treatment, but I was focused on other things. I mean, it was a co-ed facility, and I had my priorities.
Yeah, I'll bet you did. So 2 weeks after you're there, you're out, and is it back to the same game?
I didn't use right away. I think I want to say I was ready to use as soon as I got out, but I had several friends that wouldn't buy into my BS, and They said, no, you need to give yourself a chance.
So there was nothing revealed to you during those 2 weeks that would be the aha moment of your life at that point?
What was revealed to me was the physical craving and the mental obsession. But the mental obsession wasn't really. I didn't get that. I mean,
I get it.
They showed us the video, the chalk talk videos and things like that, and so it became apparent to me, and it gave me information about the physical craving and how my body breaks it down differently. But I didn't hear or learn about the mental obsession.
Okay.
And so what I thought is if I can go to keg parties and bars, as long as I don't pick up the first one, I won't get drunk.
Okay.
So, and that was kind of my philosophy, and it lasted about 2 or 3, maybe 4 weeks. And then the first time I drank, I tilted one back. It was gone instantaneously. But I couldn't drink another one because that would be drinking alcoholically.
Yeah.
But then the next weekend I was, inebriated.
This is while
I'm still in college.
You're at Kent.
Yes.
And this is going on during the term, or was it over the summer? When did this happen?
I went into treatment during the summer.
Okay.
And then, the fall semester started, and so I had started using by the time I'd gotten back into my fall semester.
Wow. So you're going into your junior year at that point?
Yes.
And
well, it was kind of sophomore, junior, because there were, I had to drop a couple of classes here and there because I wasn't going to pass them, and I was on the 5-year program.
So you're approaching 20. What happened going forward from there? When did you finally hit your bottom, and what did that look like?
It was probably about a year. It was the following summer after treatment. I was working for a painter who was paying us with rubber checks. I was back at home with mommy, which was really kind of a blow to my ego. I was very egotistical. I was very full of myself.
Sure.
Having to move home was kind of a humbling experience.
I'll bet. Yeah.
And so I'm back at home. I've got this job that's not really paying me. And it wasn't so much the exterior stuff. It wasn't the materialistic things.
Yeah.
It was the inside.
Yeah.
I'd gone to treatment, and I knew that I shouldn't be drinking or using, but I was still doing it anyway. And miraculously, this friend of mine who, we were so close, we looked alike. We went to elementary school together and junior high. We were in the brotherhood, and he and I are, we see each other. We're driving down the same street. We kind of play around a little bit. We stop, we do lunch, and I tell him, I went to, and I know he's sober. He's been sober because he's the one that went, one of the ones that went to AA, and he's got 5 years at the age of 21. I'm like, I went to treatment last year, and I've only been high or drunk 14 times since then. And he's like, wow, that's great, Jim. If you ever want to go to a meeting, give me a call. And the next day, I didn't drink that day. Let me back up a little bit. The morning before, we were on our way out to do this paint job, kind of a far out in the country. It was an airport hangar, and we got the job done. And we went fishing and water skiing and everything. And that was the last day I drank. But I'll never forget reaching for my first beer from the back seat of a 76 Cougar, and the clock's in the middle of the dashboard, and it said 8 a.m. And I knew that I was back where I'd started from. And I pulled the tab. Remember pull tabs?
Yeah, right.
I remember pull tabs.
Right,
I love pull tabs.
Yeah, you just rip it off the can.
Yeah. You used to step on them in the river and everything, but cut your foot. So that day, I had this realization that nothing's changed. And then we see each other, we do lunch, and I tell him, he says, if you ever want to go to a meeting, give me a call. And I started getting that same antsy feeling because I didn't drink that day. This was the day after. And I called him the next day, and I said, I'm ready. And he said, I'll be there. And he took me to, I think it was 3 meetings in that first day. We went to a 6 o'clock, we went to an 8 o'clock, and then we went to a midnight meeting at Night and Day Club. And that's where he introduced me to my sponsor.
We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying AA recovery interviews, I invite you to check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing yet meaningful and engaging way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, iTunes, or Amazon. While you're there, search for my other audiobook, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories from the first and or second editions, missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's also available from Amazon as a Kindle book or in paperback if you'd like to read along. You're going to love it. And we're back. That negative attitude you had about AA, did that show up in any of those first few meetings, or were you ready by that point to listen to what they were saying?
No, AA was the last stop on the block for me.
It was.
I had, all the animosity was gone. I was beaten into a state of reasonableness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And, what's interesting is an ex-girlfriend showed up at that midnight meeting, and this friend of mine knew she was an ex, and he saw what was going on and the wheels spinning through my head.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm like 24 hours out, right? I'm starting to sweat, and I'm shaking a little bit, and I'm really starting to get, I love to reference them as the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah,
your skin crawls a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
During that midnight meeting, it was a speakers meeting. We called them leads up in Cleveland.
Mm-hmm.
There was this old fat bald man up front laughing like Santa Claus, and it was kind of irritating.
Yeah.
And then this ex-girlfriend shows up, and I'm completely distracted.
Right.
And this guy that had taken me to these meetings, he sees what's going on, and after the meeting, he says, "Are you serious about this?"
Yeah.
I was a little taken aback. I probably had my feelings hurt.
Yeah.
And he says, I say, "Of course I am." And he says, "Go up to that guy over there and you tell him what's going on with you."
Mm-hmm.
And he pointed to that old fat bald man who I was kind of irritated with. And I think that, in regards to your question about, was there still any animosity towards AA?
Yeah.
All my animosity went out the door when I went up and told him my name and said, "I think I need your help."
Wow. So you found your sponsor relatively early on. I mean,
my first day of meetings.
Your first day of meetings, which is absolutely amazing.
Well, he was assigned to me.
Well, no, I get that, but I didn't get my only sponsor till I was sober almost a year because I thought I could do it myself. But I always admire people who are able to get a sponsor right away. So you got him. Did he start lining you up with meetings immediately? And did you start working the steps immediately?
Oh, that first night in meetings, he had me sit down and read the book with him. And we got down on our knees and said the third step prayer that first night.
The very first night.
Mm-hmm.
And you're 20, almost 21 at this point?
I was 21 at that point.
You were 21, okay. So you get sober, you're in AA at 21. Mm-hmm. And here we are now, 11,679 days, give or take a day or two.
No.
No, okay. No,
that's precise.
That's precise.
There's an app for that.
Yeah, that's right. I know. I think I have that app. So he gets you working on the steps. How long did it take you to get through the 12 steps?
We get down on our knees in this, at the Night and Day Club in Cleveland, Euclid, Ohio, and we say this third step prayer, and I'm doing 2-3 meetings a day after that.
Wow.
But I'm, that withdrawal is still setting in. I can't sleep.
Right.
And about, I guess it was probably, I don't know if it was right at 2 weeks, 10 days, something like that. I'm really feeling pretty bad. But I'm so close to my last drink that I know that's not the answer. But I don't know what is. And that was the problem, was I didn't have a solution.
Yeah. And,
I'd been in meetings and they were talking about a power greater than myself and everything, but I had no connection to him.
Right.
I mean, the book says it. It says, although our decision was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and be rid of these things in ourselves,
yes,
which have been blocking us.
Yeah.
God wanted to be able to help me, but he couldn't.
Yeah.
And so I'm at a speakers meeting, and it's that same Friday Night and Day Club Friday night meeting at midnight. A guy gets up at the podium and starts talking about suicide. And that's where I was. I knew I couldn't use anymore, but I didn't have a connection. There was no solution. I was like Linus. You had taken my blanket away, but I didn't have anything else.
Wow.
And I went up to him afterwards, and I told him, I said, "Listen, man, I want to blow my face off." And he smiled at me, and he said, "Do your 4th step." And so I sat down that night with one of my sponsor's sponsees, and he took me through my 4th step, and we did my 5th step that night, and I waited the hour. I didn't go home I waited the hour right there, and we did 6 and 7, and I made the list, and the next day I had it, and that same friend that took me to my first night of meetings took me over to Sister Ignatia Hospital up in Cleveland. I don't know if you remember that, but it was back in the 80s, so I put my spenders on and my thin black tie, and I went up there and I told my story to a guy. And I come out of that room fired up. I was on fire. That guy is going to stay sober.
Right.
And my friend says, yeah, that's great. How do you feel and what do you think? And, I don't think I made the connection at that point in time that really I was there to help me more than anything else.
So you were up to the 8th step within a week.
14 days.
14 days. So a couple of weeks. Had you already started to make amends by that point, or were you still in the process of...
No. It was probably 10 to 14 days before I'd made the list.
Wow.
And then started... And this is... I love this. You sober up a horse thief, and what you've got is a better horse thief.
Right.
So to make amends to my mother, I went out and I stole landscape material and, did her yard for her. And my sponsor said, well, where'd you get the money for that? It's just... we're so sick, and it takes us so long to get better.
That's
but,
rich.
I was well intended.
Oh my gosh, doing a 9th step by committing a crime. That's amazing.
It just shows you that little thug hoodlum mentality that I had.
What's interesting about this part of your story, Jim, is that a lot of people talk about the time frame of working the steps. And it seems to me that especially up in that part of the country, because you in Cleveland aren't too far from the birthplace of this movement, but it used to be that people would be taken through the steps much, much more rapidly than they are these days.
My experience was, I did my 3rd step in my first night of meetings, and I did my 4th step within the first 2 weeks.
Sure.
And I can tell you this, it felt like I OD'd on AA.
Really?
And people talk about, they're brainwashing you. Well, my brain needed to be washed.
Yeah.
All I thought about was using. And so I had finally been able to make the connection between that physical craving and that mental obsession. And what I realized and what the book says is that, when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. And so if I want to be able to get over that physical craving, and I don't want to have to suffer and struggle with the mental obsession, I've got to get right with God. And I don't think, the book's specific. It talks about that decision, and it says at once, and it says next.
Right.
So I feel badly for people who have waited, because it's suffering to me.
Yeah.
And I suffered for that year in between treatment and going to AA.
Yeah.
That was long enough. I don't know if I could have lasted. I mean, you talk about, waiting a year because you were trying to sponsor yourself, and thank God for effective sponsorship. And so when I work with men who are new in recovery or old in recovery, the first thing I do is get them going on their steps.
Yeah. And you move them through it pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
Because there's no time to lose. And once you got their attention, you got to capitalize on it.
I can't keep me sober. I can't keep them sober.
So you're in AA. You worked all your steps within a relatively abbreviated period of time. So what do the next number of years look like? You're still in Cleveland at this point?
Yes. Well, one of the things is I'm still in college, right? I've gone to treatment. I've gotten out. I've used for another year. I'm now sober, and this is over the summer. I got sober on June 21st of '89. I go back to college and proceed to try to do my best to get my grade point up. My first semester, my grade point was a 197, and it wasn't the worst in my dorm room. And so I climbed my way out academically, ended up with like a 3.5, I think, Hume.
Wow.
Started to build a profession and a career for myself as a child life specialist, which is addressing emotional and developmental needs of hospitalized children. And my mother kind of introduced me to that career. It was, I think there was definitely some of my own personal history in regards to not having mommy and daddy around.
Sure.
My sister was hospitalized when she was young, and she remembers still to this day the trauma of not having my mother there with her, because back then they wouldn't allow that. And so I graduate. I think I had about 18 months at that point in time. And
you were going to meetings in Kent.
I was going to meetings in Akron and Kent. I told my story at Akron City Hospital.
Oh, yeah.
Went to Founders Day, went to Dr. Bob's house, did retreats on Lake Erie.
Wow.
And yeah, so I was doing meetings kind of back and forth. I did an internship at Rainbow Babies and Children's, and so I was going kind of in between Kent and Cleveland weekly. Was offered a position, fairly quickly. I think December. I graduated like the summer of was when my internship was completed. So it was probably right around, a year, like I said, a year, maybe 15, 16 months, something like that. Was offered a position at San Antonio Children's Hospital. Went and they served me chips and salsa, and I never looked back. Yeah, moved to San Antonio, packed as much into an 87 Honda Civic that I could, and relocated to San Antonio, Texas, and started going to meetings.
Coming from Cleveland and Akron and the kind of AA that they have up there, was it a shock for you to come into AA in San Antonio, or were there vast differences, or did you find the similarities very quickly?
Oh, no, they didn't do it right. No. It's real interesting because, in Cleveland, and I don't know, it may not be that way anymore, but a majority of the meetings were leads where someone stood up and told their story, and then people would thank you and or tell you you're full of it if you weren't telling the truth from the podium.
But they weren't discussion meetings.
It wasn't open discussion meetings and things like that. And so I get to San Antonio, and I maybe went to one speaker meeting every other week or something like that, and everything else was discussion. And I think people got tired of cutting me off because I would talk for 10 or 15 minutes because I wasn't used to talking for 2 or 3 instead. And so there was definitely some adjustment.
I see.
When I went to San Antonio, I went to a club that'll remain nameless, and they were talking about a dance, and they were talking about bingo, and I just kind of didn't get the sense that it was the right place for me. So then I went out to a club on the northeast side of town called Serendipity, and I walk through the door. I go to pour myself a cup of coffee, and the first thing I hear is some guy telling some other guy, "You need to work your fifth step." And that man, it's interesting. He just called me yesterday. We've been friends ever since.
Wow.
And he was the best man at my wedding. And, I'd kind of found a home group at that point in time.
Cool.
Found a sponsor there. And, I was in San Antonio for about 2 years. And then I had to get a little culture before I came to Houston.
Right, I get that. Okay, so you came to Houston when you were about 4 years sober?
Might have been 5. Yeah, it's 5 years sober, I guess.
Wow.
Almost 5.
Now, were you actively sponsoring men in San Antonio?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What did you do with those guys when you came to Houston?
I probably told them, because back then, this was 94. I think I still carried a pager back then.
Yeah, right. I remember those days. Yeah.
Cell phones came out like 96 or something like that. I probably told them that they either needed to ask my sponsor to sponsor them or to find somebody before I left. Because it's different nowadays. If I had a FaceTime and Zoom and all these wonderful things that have been so effective in enduring the pandemic.
Yeah. So you get here to Houston, and what did you find that you liked and didn't like about Houston AA?
What I loved was there was a strong young people's presence in Alcoholics Anonymous. They had Hickey Paw and all those things. Yeah. And I remember going to Whitney when I was young. That was nice. It was nice to have people who had a significant amount of recovery close to my time, maybe more. There's several guys that got sober when they were 18, 19 years old back then who, still have 3 or 4 years up on me. And that's great. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And so I guess for me it was nice to have that. It was much more it was a professional decision more than anything else. I was offered a director's position at Shriners Hospitals for Children, and so I took that, and it was very much a career move. But San Antonio is a little bit of a sleepy retired town. Yeah. And I don't know if it's that so much anymore, but Houston's a big city. And that's where I was. I was used to Cleveland and the big city.
Yeah. So you came to Houston, you got yourself immediately engaged with AA.
I moved into an apartment that was probably 2 blocks from the VA hospital. And I think I moved on a Sunday, and there was a Tuesday meeting scheduled there at the VA. And I go over, and the patients are running the meeting. And I said, no, that's not the way this is supposed to work. And so I kind of absconded that meeting for myself and started doing that meeting on a consistent basis. I think it probably lasted, I don't know if it lasted a decade, but it was probably between 7 and 9 years, something like that. And any of the men that I sponsored were obliged to come with me. And we saw guys fall out and have seizures there in the middle of the meeting. And there's something powerful about being on the front lines.
Yeah. And you've always been one of those kind of guys too, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely.
With going down to the rougher sides of town. What is there about that appeals to you more than some of these higher end meetings that you and I know about?
Well, I mean, knowing my history, I didn't grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth. I think alcoholism it's not prejudice. I don't think there's no line of delineation between, which side of the tracks you grew up on or any of those things. Right. I guess for me, if I can make it, then so can they. Yeah. I sponsor guys who come from very wealthy families. I sponsor men who come from very little. And so I don't know that it's, one side of town or the other. Yeah. I think it's both sides of town. And that I think is, one of the things that attracts me. I live on the west side. I go to a lot of east side meetings and sponsor a lot of men from the east side, but there's several men from the west side that I sponsor, and I go to several meetings over here.
How do you feel about those guys, though, who, and I remember this a lot early on and over the years, guys would say, well, you got to go down to the 24-hour club because that's real alcoholism. Or you got to go down to the Ship Channel area and other areas of town, the rougher parts of town, and there you'll see real AA. How do you feel when you hear that?
Yeah, it goes back to the point you made about being from Cleveland. I was spoon-fed this program, and I don't think it matters what side of town I'm on. It's my responsibility to spoon-feed the men that I sponsor the steps and hopefully help them build a relationship with God. But I do think this. I think there's probably the sense of desperation can be stronger. If you have less. I mean, I've seen people kill themselves with their parents' checkbook or their own checkbook. And because there's less, the consequences don't seem as dramatic. And something that's been really, it's been on my heart a lot lately, is this is a fatal illness. It's not a chronic disease. It kills.
It
and
does.
The book says that. I mean, we buried an 18-year-old 2 weeks ago.
That's rough.
He was from the nicer part of town.
Yeah, I get that.
I think there's a sense of desperation that can be seen when you don't have the resources maybe that some do. But I don't think my alcoholism is any different because I did or didn't have money. Yeah.
Well, you know what I've realized and what I've found? I've been doing these big book podcasts and, of course, reading the first and second editions. Personal stories in the first edition and a lot of the personal stories in the second edition are stories of people who have gone all the way to the bottom, people who are living out on the streets, people who are riding the rods, as one of the stories is entitled. You don't see the number of stories of people with whom I can relate to their situation in life. I can relate to them as an alcoholic, but I never lived out on the streets. I never had to hop a freight train to get from here to there. I never drank shoe polish or Sneaky Pete or whatever it was. But it occurs to me that the way AA grew, even up to the second printing of the Big Book in 1955, a lot of the stories were stories of really harsh circumstances and real desperation within those circumstances. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a really good observation, and I would have to assume is because of the maturation process of Alcoholics Anonymous, what we've done is we've been able to reach out and touch people that may not have been as bad off as it used to be. And so the ability to intervene at a younger stage, and thank God, because if I hadn't come to Alcoholics Anonymous at 21, God knows, I've got a guy I sponsor just celebrated 29 years, and he got sober at 21 as well.
Wow.
We were having a conversation about what would our lives look like without recovery right now. Would we even be alive? And I don't know that I would have made it past 21, 22, 23, 24. I mean, like I said, this kid, that parents and I go to church together, and I watched him grow up, and at 18 we're having his funeral. He had access to and was exposed to recovery, and that I think is a benefit today.
Yeah.
I think if you had asked people in the 50s or the 60s, had they ever heard of Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't know that you would get the same percentage that you do today.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that, Jim, is that even today, the perception that young people have about Alcoholics Anonymous is people living under the bridge. And my guess is a lot of the people who are saying that have never actually seen an alcoholic who's living under a bridge. Mm-hmm. What they're going by is what they may have understood older people, what they thought was an alcoholic.
Oh, no. Well, that was my definition.
Yeah,
it's
mine
the
too.
Brown paper bag under the bridge.
Yeah.
And then I go to treatment and they talk about that physical craving.
Right.
And it changed a little bit of my attitude.
Yeah.
Because I identified, when I drink one, I drink another,
Right.
and I don't stop and I keep going and until it's all gone or my money's all gone. Maybe that's kind of the observation is because Alcoholics Anonymous has been, established for not quite 100 years yet, but we have the ability to reach people who haven't gone quite as far down the scale.
Right, and the thing is, we are only a couple of generations removed from the founding of the program, so we are not all that far down the road. I mean, 100 years from now, it would be interesting to see, as you get more and more generations.
One of the reasons that I'm so strongly committed to sharing what's in the book versus what's my opinion.
Right. Yeah, you've always been a book guy. I mean,
everybody's played the telephone game.
Yeah.
When you write it down, the message doesn't change, but when you whisper it in the guy's ear next to you and it goes around the circle, you never know what's going to come back in your other ear.
Yeah, I get that. One of the reasons why I started the AA Recovery Interviews podcast was because for a guy like you, there's like 29, 30 years between the point at which you got sober and started working your program and today. Mm-hmm. What I like to point out to people and what I wanted the podcast to do was to talk about some of the things that happened between the getting sober and the today, which were difficult times, sublime times, times of great enjoyment, times of utter despair, and how you got through them. Can you think of some of those off the top of your head?
Oh, absolutely. Life's life. And that's what I think some people, they come into Alcoholics Anonymous and think it's all going to be rainbows and unicorns. And life goes on.
It does.
I struggled with relationships in my first decade of recovery. I didn't know how to have a healthy relationship. I let my brother-in-law pick my wife for me because I had a bad picker or I just wasn't the right guy is probably more the truth.
So your brother-in-law or your brother, who was it?
Well, it's my wife's sister's husband. He and I worked together, and so he was he had accepted a new position at another organization. And at his going away party, she and I had met, and we had talked a little bit about being introduced. And anyway, so everybody in my family had been divorced at least once, most of them twice. I really had very little understanding or clarity. I took hostages. I didn't have relationships.
Yeah.
And if you didn't worship me, then I didn't, I had to worship you. And anyway, so, but I'm proud to say, I've been happily married for the last 23 years and we have two beautiful children. We lost a child in between the two. Life is a miraculous thing.
Yeah.
I'll never forget, I was on a mountaintop in Colorado with a bunch of little adolescent drug addict alcoholics because, it was one of those adolescent programs.
Yeah.
Through, an alternative peer group. And we had just come off the mountain from this camping trip over the summer. And, my wife calls and, I call her when we get down to base camp and she says, yeah, I'm pregnant. And that was, I just stood there and cried like a baby with all these teenagers. We said the Lord's Prayer and it's just powerful stuff. And
that was your older son she was pregnant with?
Yes. That was our firstborn.
So this is what,
21 years ago.
21 years ago.
Sure.
Wow.
And
so there's a gift. You also mentioned the tragic loss of the...
Yeah, our second son was, at 21 weeks, he was diagnosed with, 21 weeks. What I say that is
in utero.
Yeah. Anencephalic. He was anencephalic.
Yeah, okay.
And so the skull doesn't develop. And they said, they told my wife that she could carry him full term, but he wouldn't make it.
Right.
So she decided to deliver him at 24 weeks, and he was stillborn. and it was devastating. I mean,
That must have been really tough.
It gave me a stronger appreciation for life than I'd ever had before.
Yeah.
And what's so ironic is that I never respected my own life, and had always, treated this gift that I've been given with such maliciousness.
Yeah.
We endure that grief.
Right.
And I don't think that's something you ever get over. I think grief is something that you learn to live with, and that's one of the things that I learned and studied is that it's time doesn't heal my grief. I think the grief stays with me. I think it wanes a little bit, but it's not something I get over.
Tell me about during that time, that very, very tragic experience that you went through. Tell me about your program at that time and how the program might have contributed to you being pulled through intact.
Well, for me, it's real simple. I said earlier, when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. And I struggled with God at that point in time. How dare you was kind of my perspective. And why was another strong perspective of why. And, what I came to terms with is some questions aren't meant for me to have answers to. But there was never a point in time where I thought about drinking. And that's the miracle of this program is if I continue to do the things I need to. 10 steps says it. We continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. And I was resentful at God, and I was being dishonest with myself. And I had a sponsor.
Right.
I was sponsoring other men. I was going to meetings. I pray every day religiously, and that's not to say that I have to have a Bible to pray, but I pray religiously. In other words, I'm committed to it. Having all those tools and continuing to use all those tools kept me going in regards to enduring that traumatic experience.
Yeah, I get that.
A year later, my wife gave birth to my daughter, who at 6 weeks was diagnosed with meningitis. And she, we got her to the hospital, thank God, fairly quickly, and she doesn't struggle now from any ramifications of that. But, my mother, who had been ostracized from the church during her divorce, had carried a resentment against religion, God, and the church for 36 years, all of my life. And, we called, and I told her that Kayla had been hospitalized. And, for the first time in my life, my mother said she was going to pray.
Oh, wow.
And it's those kinds of things that even during difficult times, even when life stinks, being able to see God's presence in that. It's really powerful.
The important thing is that I've seen your story, and I don't want to lose sight of the fact that you and I have known each other a long time, but we didn't get as close as we've gotten, which is very close, until we shared the common experience of what happened to our good friend and watching him go through what he went through in his last days on this earth as a result of the liver cancer. And that experience, watching all the men gather around and go to his house at that hospital bed, and you were there and I was there and a number of other men were there, there was something so spiritual about that. Did you get that sense as well?
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful. Well, first and foremost, I love John with all my heart. And I miss him tremendously still today. And, thank God for those hours and days that we spent in that townhome with him and helping him, transition and die peacefully, because it gave us an opportunity to connect. And there were 3 or 4. Tom, I think, was one. And so, there's always good that can come out of whatever it is that we experience, but we've got to be able to, our eyes have to be open to it.
Yeah. And that's what they were. What amazed me was right up to his dying day, and we were there literally the day he passed and the day after, he was always asking about how you doing. He knew that we were concerned about him, but he's right up to the end. It was how are you doing? And there was nothing you could say to him that he wouldn't figure out a way to connect with. I know, and it was. I learned so much from him, and getting to know you better was the gift that came out of that. So I am convinced that you and I being as close as we are is no coincidence that God brought us together for a purpose.
Sure.
And I knew when I started this podcast that I wanted you as one of the people on there because I admire the program that you work. There are days that I sit in meetings wishing, God, I wish I had that photographic memory of the big book that Jim has, because people, they could read the passage to me and I forget it in the next 15 seconds. That might be...
Well, this coming from the man who knows every name of every man in the meeting.
Yeah,
so
I work pretty hard at that. But,
which I think is important. And it's one of the things I love about you and getting to know you. And I remember being in Cleveland and being required to greet at the door.
Yeah.
And people look at you kind of like they look at me when I tell them how many days I have while you're greeting at the door.
Yeah.
And they don't get it.
They don't get it. But you do it enough and people get used to it. In fact, when you introduce yourself, the very few times I've heard you introduce yourself over the years, and you don't say the number of days, I'm like, wait a second, he missed something. So I wish we had another hour or two to just kind of share, but we've had the opportunity to share some of the real highlights of your sobriety and the fact that you got sober at 21 and you've had 30 years of life in the AA lane. What's that meant to you?
Well, okay, so I used to bristle with antagonism at religion, and I can feel the nearness of my Creator in a church today. I no longer am a prisoner of self, and I have a freedom, so to speak, in regards to not being captive to this illness. And not being a victim of it. It's the one disease that actually the treatment can be beneficial for. And there's not a lot of that out there. I've got several men who close with thank God for Alcoholics Anonymous and thank Alcoholics Anonymous for God. And so I think it's probably the best way to end it. And I love you. And when you do your interview, I want to be the interviewer.
Well, thank you. And I love you, Jim. You're a big part of my life, and I appreciate you doing this. And we'll get around to my interview one of these days. But for now, I want to thank you so much for doing this. And I know it's going to change some people's minds. It may change some people's lives just to hear about your experience and the fact that you were able to do it starting at 21. I had to wait until I was almost 31, but looking back, it took every single one of those days to get me to that point, and it's taken every single one of the days since that point. In your case, 11,467. Am I right?
Or 679.
All right. Forget it. All right. Well, that's a wrap, my brother. Thanks so much, Jim. This worked out great.
Thanks, Howard.
Okay. You bet. Well, my friends, that's a wrap for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed AA Recovery Interviews, will you please tell others how to listen to it? It's another helping hand we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. If you want to contact me directly with any comments, questions, or suggestions, simply email howard@aarecoveryinterviews.com. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs. AA Recovery Interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.